Today, we're headed up to the rooftop of the Constitution State. Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're heading up to the Rooftop of Connecticut. Before we start this adventure, though, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Located in Litchfield County, the Highpoint of Connecticut is found in the lower part of the Taconic Mountains, a subrange of the Appalachians. Stretching a distance of about 200 miles, they start across the river in New York and then clip the corner of northwest Connecticut before heading north, hugging the western border through Massachusetts, eventually dwindling out in southern Vermont. If you're looking for the wild places in Connecticut, then this here is where you'll find them. Litchfield County is the least populated county in the state, and in this rugged landscape, you'll find not one, but two mountain ranges. To the west, you have the lesser-known Teconics, and to the east, the Berkshires, who have long overshadowed their fellow range in popular imagination. That's unfortunate, though, because the Taconic Mountains have a fascinating geological history of all their own. They grow out of the Hudson Highlands to the south, with whom they share some geological similarities, but then become their own range. At the heart of these mountains lies significant geological events dating back hundreds of millions of years ago. These aren't the first Taconic Mountains in this location. The Ancestral Taconic Mountains were a predecessor range that were formed as the ancient continents of Baltica and Laurentia, modern-day Europe and North America, slowly moved towards each other, starting to close the Iapetus Ocean 450 million years ago. Those mountains eventually eroded away, but you can still actually find sections of exposed rock dating to that time period, and even some dating to an even older event known as the Grenville orogeny. But that's only one part of this mountain range's geological history. As the Iapetus Ocean disappeared, a volcanic chain of islands was pushed into the Laurentian continent, and Baltica would eventually collide as well. All this activity pushed up the remnants of the ancestral tectonics on the younger sediment structure. The end result, hundreds of millions of years later, are the mountains we're hiking through today. Taconic is actually an anglicization of a Lenape word, Taconic, meaning in the woods. A pretty fitting name for these forested peaks. But interestingly enough, the Lenape didn't have their lands here. Their lands were actually to the west, in New York. It was different Algonquin peoples that lived in Connecticut. Regardless, all of them were part of a long line of indigenous people that had settled in this area for thousands of years. The first human inhabitants arrived in this area after the last ice age. One of the earliest inhabited sites discovered so far is the Avon site, dating back 12,500 years. By the time European explorers arrived, there were many different Algonquin tribes throughout the state, the strongest being the Pequots, though up here in the northwest corner it was actually part of Mohican territory. The name Connecticut comes from the Algonquin language by way of a French corruption. Connecticut, meaning besides the long tidal river. Despite the French influence on the name, it would be different European powers that would leave their mark on this state. The Dutch were the first Europeans to explore the area. Adrian Block charted Long Island Sound and sailed up the Connecticut River in 1614. Later on, the Dutch would establish a trading post and regularly trade for furs near modern-day Hartford. But they weren't the only European power to see the value in this land. The English? Well, they weren't far behind. With the success of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north, the Puritans were looking to expand, and by 1633, settlers had started to make their way into the area. And by 1650, the Dutch presence was all but gone, their trading posts taken over by the English. European colonization increased the tension with the Native Americans. The Pequot in particular were not too keen on all these newcomers, and to protect their territory began raiding new settlements. The English attacked back, and the Pequot War broke out in 1637. It would be disastrous for the Pequot, with hundreds of their people killed or sold into slavery. By the conclusion of the conflict, the Pequot tribes had all but vanished. The Mohicans, well, they wouldn't fare much better. The Beaver Wars in the 1680s would reduce their territory to basically these mountains. Then, further encroachment would push them west. Finally, in the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act would see the remaining Mohicans rounded up and forcefully relocated to Wisconsin. As mentioned earlier, this is where you come if you want to find something resembling wilderness in Connecticut. Sparsely populated with rugged and rustic charm, this area is home to quite a few of Connecticut's tallest peaks. Formed in 1751, Litchfield County is the largest county in the state, though counties in Connecticut really exist in name only. It is the towns that matter, and the closest to Mount Frissell is Salisbury, the most northwestern town in Connecticut. Salisbury would be established in 1741, 10 years prior to the county. In the early 1700s, traces of iron was discovered in this area. And for the next 200 years, it would be home to a thriving iron industry. The iron pulled out of these mountains was in high demand and became the preferred choice for Connecticut's prosperous firearms industry. The high points of the United States are a diverse collection. Whether found on plains, mountains, hills, tropical rainforests, woodlands, deserts, they almost all have a summit of some sort, whether a peak or even a gentle rise of the ground. Connecticut, though, it's one of the unusual ones, because its high point is found on the side of a mountain. Not a sub-peak like, say, Nevada's Boundary Peak, but quite literally on the side of a mountain. Here's a fun fact. If you go the standard route, you have to walk into another state, climb to the top of a mountain, and then descend back down to the border to reach the high point. It's the only state like that. So that begs the question, how did this all come about? Well, the answer to that is twofold. And the first part takes place at the very beginning of Connecticut as an English colony. In the year 1660, the colonies of Connecticut found themselves with a bit of a problem. They were successful, they were Puritan, and they had no legal standing. To exacerbate this situation, across the ocean in Great Britain, the restoration of the monarchy was unfolding, putting a king back on the English throne. The colonists of Connecticut now found themselves on the wrong side of a decades-old struggle. Connecticut had started off as a spin-off of sorts, with several small but distinct Puritan colonies made up of groups of settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first of these was the colony at Hartford, established by Thomas Hooker, the father of Connecticut. Two more would later take shape at Saybrook and New Haven. These original settlements were allowed to take shape as a matter of convenience. It was useful for the Massachusetts Bay Colony to have places to send potential malcontents and nonconformists. Two of the Connecticut colonies adopted a governance structure known as fundamental orders, the earliest precursor to our modern Constitution, and a crucial document in later events. While Connecticut may have had a robust framework for managing their colonial affairs, what they did not have was a legal basis for their very existence. In particular, a charter, which would authorize their establishment and the rules they would function under. Without one, they could easily be folded in under the rule of the Crown and lose all of their autonomy. Connecticut decided that they would not sit idly by and let somebody overseas determine their fate. They'd take a more active role. They would directly lobby the king themselves. Not only that, they would write their own charter, using their fundamental orders as its basis. All the king would have to do is sign it. Now, in order to pull this off, Connecticut knew they would have to send their very best. And fortunately for them, they had just the right man for the job. In this case, one of their best happened to be their current governor, one of the most noteworthy men of the colony, John Winthrop Jr. The colonists could not have picked a better candidate. The Winthrops were an established, wealthy, and connected family, both in New England and Great Britain, and the elder John Winthrop had served as the Massachusetts Bay Colony governor. The son didn't reside in his father's shadow, though. Well-traveled and educated, the younger Winthrop was the leading scientist in the colonies, a physician, astronomer, author, ironmaster, and businessman. He was also a skilled leader and effective diplomat, abilities which would soon be put to the test. What's really fascinating about this whole affair is that Connecticut couldn't be in a worse possible position. They had absolutely zero leverage at the negotiating table. For starters, they were a prosperous colony with no legal protection, ripe for the picking, so to speak, by a crown that was always looking for money. Not only that, they were the wrong religion. They were Puritan. And to throw a little more fuel on the fire, so to speak, they were sheltering other Puritans wanted by the crown for their role in the English Civil War, some of whom had actually signed the death warrant that had led to the beheading of Charles I, the current king's late father. On the other side of the table was Charles II. He had no reason to be magnanimous to a group of people who had charged his father with treason and then took it upon themselves to lop the head off of a sitting English king. The merry monarch had his own plans, and Connecticut, with hat in hand, looked like just the patsy he needed to put them into play. His ulterior motive was to consolidate the New England colonies into a unified group and pull them under the direct purview of the crown. To achieve his goals, he was willing to be more generous than usual, with the understanding that Connecticut, of course, would be a useful tool in his scheme. The end result of these negotiations yielded something truly remarkable. Whatever Winthrop had hoped to get from the crown had to be greatly exceeded by what he actually received. Now, not only did Connecticut get their legal protection, but the other colonies in the area were consolidated underneath it. And that's all well and good, but perhaps the most fascinating and extraordinary piece of that charter is the amazing degree of self-government that it grants to the Connecticut colony. Of all the English colonies in North America, none would be nearly as self-autonomous as Connecticut. To put this in a bit of perspective, when the American Revolution would break out a little over a century later, Connecticut actually didn't need to write a new constitution for their state. They merely crossed off the king's name from their charter and replaced it with the people of Connecticut, and then carried on using it for another 40 years. As for Charles, his plans didn't come to fruition as he had hoped. Unfortunately, after the Connecticut colony got their charter, they didn't exactly go along with the king's grand scheme, though for a few years in the 1680s, the English crown had succeeded in establishing the Dominion of New England. But it was widely hated, and it quickly fell apart after the Glorious Revolution. Despite their good fortune, it's not like things were perfect. Now, the charter was very generous with the western border, like most of the 17th century North American charters were, stretching all the way to the South Sea. They were calling the Pacific Ocean at the time. So, for one brief moment, Connecticut's high point would have been Mount Shasta, California. There are still bits of Connecticut floating around in that old territory that it used to have claim to. If you go to northeastern Ohio these days and go to the city of Cleveland, well, that's a Connecticut city, founded by a Connecticuter, Moses Cleveland. Then there's the case of Case Western Reserve University. Have you ever wondered what that was named for, the Western Reserve? Well, it's named after Connecticut's original claim to that land. Like most of the colonies after the Revolutionary War, Connecticut would cede territory to the federal government in return for absolving their debt. But unlike others, they opted to keep a chunk of their original charter grant, a section in modern Ohio that was called the Western Reserve. Connecticut would hold on to this territory till 1800. For enterprising highpointers who are looking to bag a high point in a historical remnant, then you need to head to Geauga County, Ohio, to the Sugar Loaf Benchmark. At 1,396 feet, it is the high point, or was the high point, of the Western Reserve. But while the western border makes for a fun sidebar, when it comes to Connecticut's current high point, we're much more concerned in the events that happened on the northern one. The thorn in the side for Connecticut lay to the north, the border with Massachusetts. It had been a point of tension since the advent of the colony 2 decades prior, and the language in Connecticut's new charter, on the north by the line of the Massachusetts plantation, ensured an already contentious issue would continue. After the Pequot War, it was decided that the borders between Massachusetts and Connecticut should be delineated. Now, it's about this point in the story that the shape of Connecticut's high point starts to unfold. Almost from the beginning, this border definition would be, to put it plainly, problematic. In the Massachusetts Charter, their southern border was to be a line of latitude either 3 miles south of Massachusetts Bay or 3 miles south of the southernmost bend of the Charles River, whichever of the two lay further to the south. Now that seems pretty straightforward, but surveying in the 17th century was a challenging profession particularly if you were going to trek through uncharted wilderness. With that in mind, the Massachusetts Bay Colony hired two competent professionals, Nathaniel Woodward and Solomon Safrey. These two individuals would become infamous in Massachusetts and Connecticut lore. Safrey and Woodward conducted their survey during the winter of 1642, and what they produced was pretty detailed. Unfortunately, the findings were not what was expected by the Connecticut colony. The motives, reputation, and skills of these two gentlemen have been questioned and argued about over the centuries, with accusations that they were drunken sailors, frauds, or that they were actually hired to work on something completely different than the border. Regardless, the end result of their efforts would be a border dispute for the ages. Over the next 150 years, there would be numerous surveys, with the findings being argued over and the border shifting to the north or shifting to the south. Finally, though, in 1805, both sides agreed to the boundary that we have today, bringing to a close one of the longer boundary disputes in American history. There is still a remnant of the original survey found in the northern border, the infamous Southwick Jog. Regardless, the borders set out in the Connecticut Charter have little resemblance with the modern-day state boundaries. So, while technically the state high point had been settled, the south slope of Mount Freissall, it remained unknown, because while all that time and effort had been spent to measure the land, nobody actually bothered to take the time to measure the heights of the mountains themselves. So that tells us why the high point is where it is, but it doesn't tell us how it came to be determined. There's a small collection of states where the tallest peak is not the same as the highest point. Connecticut, of course, is in that group. But what sets it apart from the others is the proximity of those two locations. You can pretty much visit both of these locations with one healthy day trip. The trailhead for Bear Mountain is right across the road from the trailhead for Mount Freissall. So what does Bear Mountain have to do with the state high point? Well, it's one of the main characters in how it came to be determined. And it all starts with one of the world's most famous encyclopedias. The encyclopedia in question was none other than the illustrious Encyclopedia Britannica. By the late 1800s, this encyclopedia series had established a reputation for its scholarship and literary style, and was considered one of the definitive sources of knowledge in the Western world. The 9th edition, in particular, was especially noteworthy. However, their entry on Connecticut had an error. It stated there was no place in the state that rose over 1,000 feet in elevation. How they arrived at that conclusion is pretty much open to debate, but prior to the 19th century, there really wasn't a whole lot of interest in determining what the state high point was. But this erroneous entry was egregious enough that one Connecticuter basically got the proverbial bee in his bonnet and decided to embark on a bit of a geographical crusade. Our hero? He wasn't just some random person from Connecticut, but a man of repute, Robin's Battle. He was born and died in this residence known as the White House in Norfolk, Connecticut. During his lifetime, he was an advisor to President Lincoln, served in the Connecticut legislature, held other offices of state and local government, was a financier, a patron of the arts, and a composer of music. He became known as the father of modern Norfolk. Battle, being a proud citizen of Connecticut, was appalled by this error and using his connections and resources available, set out to prove the Encyclopedia Britannica wrong. He hired surveyors to conduct a comprehensive survey of the state to determine its proper elevation, and also to figure out what the highest mountain in the state actually was. Now, this last little bit is an important distinction to keep in mind when talking about Connecticut's high point. The survey results were definitive, and Battle was proven right. Connecticut's elevation was almost 2.5 times what the encyclopedia had claimed, and they had determined that Bear Mountain was the tallest mountain in the state. Then Battle took it one step further, commissioning Mason Owen Travis to build a tower on the summit. Over the years, the tower fell into disrepair. Even the plaque here commemorating these affairs has become unreadable. Battle had his victory, and most likely thought the whole affair settled. Connecticut's elevation had been determined, and its tallest mountain identified. Bear Mountain would be considered the state high point for the next several decades. But, as you've probably already figured out, that's not the end of the story. And to state the obvious, Bear Mountain is not the state high point. A whole new technology would finally settle the highest point question. With the advent of aerial surveying, the truth was finally revealed. The highest point in the state actually lay to the west, in a less remarkable place, and that is where we are headed next. The trailhead for Mount Freissall can be found after driving down a long dirt road named East Road in Massachusetts until you spy the sign. Parking can be found in several lots in the immediate vicinity. If you're reading about this hike or looking at it on a map, it might seem pretty easy. But don't be fooled. Amongst high pointers, this hike is considered one of the easiest to underestimate. It is short, but incredibly strenuous. You're basically going to go up and over 2 mountains before you reach the Connecticut high point. Let's go check it out. The trail is well marked. Follow the red flashes. Be aware, though, it is steep and rocky. You may find some benefit by bringing along some trekking poles. Once you've reached this rock cairn, you'll be at the first location of our hike, the summit of Round Mountain. At an elevation of 2,296 feet, it's the second highest peak in the state of Connecticut. It's a welcome respite from the bugs and the humidity from the woods below. And the breeze and the views up here are quite enjoyable. But don't stay too long, because as steep and strenuous as coming up Round Mountain was, that's not the hard part. The hard part is yet to come, right back there. I did this hike with my usual gear. I had good footwear, brought plenty of bug repellent, and had a wind and rain jacket, plus a hat, and some snacks and plenty of water in my pack. We're now in the saddle between Round Mountain and Mount Freissall. So who's Mount Freissall named after? Well, that's a bit of a mystery, but we do have a couple of clues. Now, the Freissall family has a long history here in New England. The leading candidate is Captain William Freissall, who fought in the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, and was then later elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. Another possible candidate is James Amos of Freissell, William's son, who was also a surveyor in this area. So perhaps the son named the mountain in honor of his father. It's a nice sentiment, but more research is needed before we have a definitive answer. It's actually pretty impressive of what a tough little hike this is. I am probably about halfway up Mount Freissell now, and honestly, I underestimated this hike, but let's keep moving forward. We're now at the second location on our hike, the summit of Mount Freissell. It has an elevation of 2,454 feet. There's also a summit register up here, so make sure to sign it before you go. It's time for us to get out of Massachusetts, though, and head down the slope back to Connecticut. Our next destination will actually take us past Connecticut Highpoint, so keep on heading down the trail to the west side of the mountain, where you will come across the New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut Tri-Point. Here we are at our next destination on our hike, and the furthest point out that we're going to go. Connecticut has 2 tri-points, and to state the obvious, this is its western one. Now that we've checked this off, let's backtrack and get to our final destination. What a day. To take quick stock of what we've done, we've bagged 2 summits and checked off a tri-point. And now we find ourselves at the Rooftop of Connecticut. With an elevation of 2,379 feet, this is the 36th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.